By the late 1820s, the Cherokee had done two things. They had realized it was not feasible to act violently against the white settlers on their territory. They had also shifted their government and social system into a model that mirrored the white institutions of the Constitution, the Supreme Court, the legal system, the language, and the newspapers. All of these things had been adopted by the Cherokee. When their territory came under threat by the state of Georgia and by the settlers of Georgia, the Cherokee went to court. They took the laws, they took their treaties that they had signed, and they took the state of Georgia to court. Two cases were decided in the Supreme Court. The Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831 was dismissed by the Supreme Court as the Cherokee Nation not having standing to bring the case against Georgia because the people of the Cherokee Nation were not American citizens. It was found that they could not bring the state of Georgia to court. In Worcester versus Georgia, white missionaries brought the case on behalf of the Cherokee, and those white missionaries were found to have standing. The conclusion of the case of Worcester versus Georgia was that the Cherokee had the right to their territory, that the status of the Cherokee Nation was as a domestic dependent nation, which meant that the United States was bound to observe the treaties that it had signed with the Cherokee, and that Georgia could not send settlers in to live on Cherokee territory. Very famously, Andrew Jackson refused to enforce that. It was against Jackson's personal interest to have the Cherokee treaties upheld. Remember, he wants Cherokee territory for himself. The quote that is attributed to him, probably he didn't say, but it was the spirit of saying, the Chief Justice has made this decision, let him enforce it. And of course, you know from the Constitution, it's the job of the president to enforce Supreme Court decisions or any kind of law. The president is supposed to enforce it. And when the president refuses to enforce it, nothing happens. And that's exactly what happened. Even though the Cherokee won their case in Worcester versus Georgia, it did absolutely nothing to stop Georgia from encroaching on Cherokee territory. While this was going on, the Cherokee were not presenting a united front. Of course, it's a diverse community with diverse opinions. The Ridge family, Major Ridge and his son, John Ridge, believed that the Cherokee had to leave their land, that yes, they would sign one more treaty with the United States, but it would be a treaty that surrendered the Cherokee territory along the Tennessee River and accepted land to the west. Those who want to stay in their territory and to continue to fight for their right to remain in Georgia and Tennessee was led by John Ross, and today we call them the National Party. These two groups faced intensifying divisions. In general, the Treaty Party was supported by villages that were further to the west in Cherokee territory. The eastern groups of Cherokee tended to support John Ross and the National Party. In the face of these divisions, the town itself of New Echota was abandoned. At the same time, so we need to make up a timeline that shows how all of these events are overlapping. Andrew Jackson promoted and signed federal legislation for the removal of Native Americans from the eastern United States. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 addressed all of the tribes in the eastern United States, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Kiowa, the Iroquois. Everybody was covered by the Indian Removal Act. And the text of the Indian Removal Act said that any Eastern tribe could exchange their current territory acre to acre for land to the west of the Mississippi River. Some Cherokee had already done this. The furthest western groups had already exchanged their land for land in Arkansas. Now, every Native American group is being encouraged to trade their land in the east in exchange for land in the west. The problem with this, and we know this today because we know about geography, that 2 acres of land in Georgia will grow a lot more crops than 2 acres of land in Oklahoma. The climate is different, the ecology is different, everything is different. So the tribes that did leave the east and went out into the west found they could not support themselves through the methods and in the standards that they were used to. They had to relearn entirely new ways of making a living. But in theory, this removal was voluntary. The subtext of the legislation was that the United States would do anything that they could to push the Native Americans into choosing this removal. They would continue to push harder and harder through legislation, through settlement, through military acts against Native Americans until the Native Americans just couldn't stand to stay in their original eastern territories any longer. Even while the Indian Removal Act was being passed, John Ross was continuing to work in Washington to secure Cherokee territory. He continually made the point that the Indian Removal Act applied to Native Americans who wanted to continue their traditional way of life. The Cherokee had changed their traditional way of life. The Cherokee had adopted things the Americans thought were civilized. They had adopted a constitution. They had adopted children's education. They had adopted slavery. And so John Ross continues these diplomatic efforts to refuse a removal treaty and to sign a new treaty that would protect the Cherokee within their existing territory. So that's going on. That's a part of what's happening at the same time as the court cases that are going through. So we've got the Cherokee using the courts to try to stay in their territory, and we've got John Ross using diplomacy to try to protect their territory. Nevertheless, the white encroachments in Georgia got stronger and stronger and stronger. The Treaty Party gained strength. John Ross lost authority in the Cherokee Council. And finally, a majority of the council authorized Ross to discuss removal. He asked for and was offered $5 million in addition to the land. So what he's discussing in Washington is that the Cherokee will remove to Oklahoma, they will get an equivalent amount of land in Oklahoma, and they'll get $5 million. He was in the midst of these negotiations when the United States government lost patience with negotiating with John Ross and turned to negotiating with the Treaty Party and Major Ridge and John Ridge. The Treaty Party, so now this is running around John Ross. They're ignoring John Ross's diplomacy, and the Treaty Party signed a treaty with representatives of the United States in New Echota. They go back to that abandoned town of New Echota in 1835, and they sign this treaty. At that point, the Treaty Party represented about a third of the Cherokee Nation. Most of the Treaty Party does sign the Treaty of New Echota. It's signed by hundreds of people, but still a minority of the Cherokee Nation. On the strength of the Treaty of New Echota, the United States begins moving toward pushing all of the Cherokee off their land. That leads to the Trail of Tears. Between 1835 and 1838, the United States was telling the Cherokee to leave. The United States kept saying, "We have this treaty. You signed a treaty. It's time to go. We're going to take your land. Get off our land. You signed a treaty. Your land isn't your land anymore." And for 3 years, the National Party of the Cherokee resisted. They said, "No, we didn't sign that treaty. It's not a legitimate treaty. We need a new kind of a treaty that allows us to stay on our land." Finally, in 1838, President Van Buren authorized military force to move the Cherokee. The United States Army moved into Cherokee territory and drove the Cherokee they encountered into concentration camps in the point where Missouri and Illinois come together. Literally, a concentration camp is a place where you want to pull together a population, to concentrate a population in one place. So the Cherokee were gathered up from across their territory and concentrated into these camps in Missouri. While they were gathering the Cherokee into the camps, a lot of people had to wait in the camps for months and months and months. So this gathering begins in the early summer of 1838. It's not until the end of October in 1838 that they decide, okay, we've got everybody we're going to get. Now's the time to move these people out to what they called Indian Territory. Today it's modern day Oklahoma. So the walk from Missouri to Oklahoma began in October. This is the middle of winter, and they're walking through mountains and across fields through blizzards. It's horrible. It's people who have been cooped up in camps and subjected to illness and poor food for months and months and months, then told, okay, now you're going to walk hundreds of miles to get to a new place. The death rate on the Trail of Tears was approximately 25% of the people who embarked died. They did not keep very good records. The most common estimate that I see is that 16,000 people set out on the Trail of Tears and that 4,000 died along the way. That is why this journey got the name the Trail of Tears. Often you'll see Trail of Tears used as a generic term equivalent to Indian removal. It's really refers specifically to this event in 1838 and into 1839 of the forced expulsion of the Cherokee from their territory on the Tennessee River. Once the Cherokee were removed, the other tribes were already gone. The Choctaw, the Chickasaw, they had already been removed. And then the Cotton Kingdom could spread supreme. Everything that you're seeing on this map that's in the purple, the Cotton Territory, had been Native American territory until 1810. After 1810, cotton swept the people away. And in sweeping away the Native American community, they swept in the African American community. This is the same strip of land where the highest density of African American population still lives today. Once the Cherokee were in Oklahoma, they were still served by the centralization and adaptation that they had undertaken in the early part of the 19th century. Major and John Ridge were both murdered within a year of their arrival in Oklahoma. John Ross remained the principal chief until 1866 when he died, eventually did negotiate the full payment of $5 million and oversaw the reestablishment of Cherokee infrastructure in Oklahoma, building a new capital, building schools. They retained their identity as a nation, and ultimately, because of their anger at the United States, they joined the Confederacy during the Civil War. The territories that they were granted in 1839 were reduced to much smaller pieces of territory in the late 19th century, and that reduced the Cherokee territory to the Cherokee Reservation that you can see on maps today. The Cherokee Nation, however, remained one of the most important political powers in Oklahoma and is still one of the largest ethnic groups in the state of Oklahoma today.